this is an intriguing one, and one that I think would be an interesting conversation for this show, Mark. Would the Big Ten consider going back to 8 conference games? So you and I have talked about the inequity that's created because the SEC plays 8, the Big Ten plays 9. And this is what Tony said. Don't care about how many conference games are played, but when you expand at large, then it's about how you compete during conference season. Would he consider more at-large teams? Need to try and get the selection process right and make it easier for the committee. Thinks the committee does a great job. If it's a specific allocation, then it doesn't matter how many conference games someone plays. So I don't know how much of that you agree with. But that's a conversation you and I have had about this is the Big Ten layout in the past.
Well, I just recorded Michigan podcast with Steve Deace, and that turned out to be like 3/4 of our conversation. He hit on the playoff model, and we strongly disagree on the best playoff model. And he likes this 4-4-2-2-1-3 business, and I just don't.
4-2-3-3-1.
4-4.
You might have to explain that one.
Okay, you got 4 for the Big Ten, 4 for the SEC, 2 for the ACC, 2 for the Big 12, 1 group of 5, 3 at large.
Okay, what don't you like about that?
I don't like that we're predetermining playoff spots before the season starts, before anybody has scored a point.
Then how do you resolve inequity across the Power 4? I just called it earlier in the last show. I said we call it Power 4, but
at least let it play out. Let it play out on the field, and then let reasonable people make a decision on what teams earned playoff spots.
The problem is, can human beings be reasonable when they're looking at records across multiple conferences against different competition? I think that's probably the issue that arises when you don't preset.
I get that, because I'm not a proponent of a committee myself. I would build an objective playoff system is what I would do. However, we have had a committee for 11 years, and they have not made any egregious errors. None. Zero. For as much as I don't like a committee, they've made some calls like Penn State, Ohio State 2016, where there's a conversation on both. Yeah, they've had to make difficult decisions, but anyone would, or even an objective system would leave out a team that we would argue and say, well, they might be better than the number 4. So they've had to make a few decisions like that, but they haven't made egregious errors. And so we've trusted them this far, and we still have this non-objective system regardless. They're still going to be in play in this 4-4-2-2-1-3 deal. They're still going to be making some selections.
Right. But I guess my issue, and I don't know what Dace's argument for that. I mean, this is the first time I've heard that proposal in that terminology before, Mark, but I guess there's still 3 at larges. So I think, if I'm reading what he's describing correctly, the Big 12 and ACC would still be eligible for those 3 at-large spots.
Yes.
I think the idea is there's going to be very few years where there's more than 7 teams collectively from those 2 conferences that deserve a spot in the 12-team playoff. Yeah, is that fair to say? You're getting 4 teams in the Big 10 and 4 teams in the SEC. If there's teams that are okay, and if there are teams that are from the ACC and the Big 12 that are just better than those lower tier, or the bottom 2 teams from each of those conferences, the SEC and the Big 10, that deserve spots, then they'll get at-large spots. I think that's the premise here, correct?
That is the premise. The other issue I have with it is if you are taking the top 4 teams from the Big 10 and you are using the Big 10 standings, those aren't necessarily the 4 best teams in the Big 10.
Well, who's using the Big 10 standings?
That's what I'm understanding, is that they would use the standings because there are going to be 4 teams from the Big 10. So you would use the Big 10 standings because that's more objective than factoring in non-conference games.
Well, yeah. The problem is, until you can create equal conferences and equal schedules, you really can never rely on conference standings. You just can't. Right? Am I right or wrong?
You can't rely on non-conference games because those are definitely not equal.
Correct. That's true. That's true. That's what. Yeah, exactly. When you're trying to weigh 130 plus FBS teams for 12 spots,
yeah,
you can't play everybody. So